welcome to the first episode of a new series, Rapid Space History. The series where I'm going to talk about, basically, as I'm saying it, a topic from history involving space in a very short amount of time. For me, anyways. These will average about 5 minutes a video, maybe closer to 10. But I've decided to start off this series, a topic that before I researched it for this video, I had no clue really about anything involving it, and that is the Proton Rocket. Proton, it's a rocket by it's a Russian rocket that's a heavy lift vehicle. It does a bunch of stuff for the ISS, or just a bunch of space shuttle kind of stuff. Wow, especially space station-y kind of stuff. So that's what I am going to start off with. Now, before we get on to this, keep in mind this is an extreme oversimplification of this rocket and its history. If this video does well, I might make a much more in-depth episode on the main series on this channel about it. But let's get actually into the main thing about this. Proton's early life. Proton, like many other Soviet rockets, started out as an ICBM. Looks like many others because that's true. Similarly, Soyuz, which I do mention multiple times in this episode, were made to be an ICBM first. Now, Proton would be a super heavy ICBM, but it's still an ICBM. It was designed to carry a 100 megaton or larger thermonuclear warhead over a distance of 13,000 kilometers. The thing is, this is way too big for an ICBM, unrealistic, there's no reason for that. And it also meant that any time it was used, or would have been, it wasn't ever used for an ICBM, really. It wouldn't be at full capacity, because there was no reason to. You didn't need that. But the thing is, this meant there was no point in having it be an ICBM. It was designed to. That was basically the same capability of others. So, it was decided to turn it into an SLV, which I mentioned multiple times, or a space launch vehicle. Let's talk actually about the process of how I went from being an ICBM to an SLV. This is one of the longer chapters of this video. First, we gotta back up a bit. Proton and the rest of the rockets like it, because Proton, even though it's the only one that actually ever flew, was more of a family. Was part of a much larger family of ULVs, Universal Launch Vehicles, and pretty crazy stuff. But they were all the brainchildren of, I am probably not going to say this right, Vladimir Kalimis. I'm saying that once. Design Bureau, officially known as OKB-52. That would be a topic for another video on how the Soviet space program was built up. But the thing is, after it failed to be an ICBM, Proton became a competitor to Sergei Korolev's and won. The Proton itself could not take this task. It couldn't do it. But a later version would be able to, a version that was proposed to occur that never happened, because the N1 got chosen for that. Korolev actually openly opposed the idea of this rocket at all in the most of its family, and that's because they all used hypergolic propellant. If you don't know, hypergolics are extremely toxic and ignite on contact. Who's no really good rocket fuel. Also, another fun fact about this rocket is that it had to be transported by rail, because that's how everything was transported at this time in the Soviet Union. There was no real air travel with stuff like this. It was too kind of commercial, you could say. Due to this, though, it has a very unusual design that makes it kind of stand out. It's got the center core, really. It's not really cool, but it's a center core that has the oxidizer in it, and that's the oxidizer tank. The outer tanks all the fuel tanks and also the engine mounts. There are no engines on the central core itself. Something Proton does that American rockets don't do is that the second stage ignites before the first is done burning. Soyuz does this too, by the way. But the reason they both do this is so that all of the fuel in that upper stage is at the bottom of the tanks when it's time for that burn, which is actually not a bad idea. And so that's always at the bottom of the tanks. In American rockets, we instead have a bunch of pipework and whatnot that gets that all propelled down to the bottom. This is also why, like Soyuz, it also has a lattice inner stage, which has got those like diamonds, like those triangles all over it, and that's so that the exhaust can go out the side and doesn't go into the bottom, because that wouldn't go well. Testing in the public eye. Proton's biggest issue at first was that due to a rushed development, it had many failures from 1965 to 1972. It was having constant failures. It had all of these failures. A side effect of this is that it meant Proton didn't finish its state trials, which is a thing that happened in the Soviet Union, until 1977, nearly 10 years after the first one launched. Think about that. Due to that it launched weather satellites frequently, the design was also kept secret for a long time. In fact, most people didn't get to see it until the launch of Mir's core module. If you don't know, Mir is the Russian space station that was built before the ISS even existed at the time. Like, it existed, but it wasn't really a thing. And this launched in 1986. So for another 10 years after it became a reliable launch vehicle, people didn't really get to see what it looked like, because it was extremely secretive, like most things were, but it was extremely secretive. When the full stack, the whole Proton Rocket, was seen on TV for press, so it was seen on TV, and also for press and whatnot in the actual launch. Proton does actually do commercial launches, though, even though it does heavily do special stuff for the Soviet Union, so for Russia. But most of these are actually managed by ILS, or the thing called the International Launch Services. The end is coming. Not for us. Proton. Proton, even though it has been a great vehicle throughout its time and has been very reliable, like a bunch of the stuff Russia's doing, they want to get rid of it. And I can kind of see why, because it's a pain in the butt for them. Because all these rockets were built during the Soviet Union days, which meant they had stuff coming from all over. Because, it launches in Kazakhstan, but it's a Russian rocket. They're saying. Because it wasn't meant to be built in a split union. It was meant to be in the whole big Soviet Union. So that causes issues that Russia doesn't like, and they want to get rid of it, and they want to replace it with newer stuff anyways. But the thing is, Proton has, from what I could tell, production has been halted since 2018. And the reason for this is not a technical issue. That's because it is being replaced with a new rocket called the Angara. I'm not going to about this much, because I'm going to probably make an episode on it anyways. But unlike Proton, Angara will use normal propellants, so like OP1 LOX, not hypergolics. Also be a lot cheaper than Proton, though. That's the big thing about it, is be a lot cheaper. So that is the history of Proton, extremely simplified, and put into a very short amount of time. But that's not the purpose of these videos. The purpose of these is to test ideas for bigger episodes like I talked about earlier, which I could totally do, see how this goes, right? Also test other things, like for instance, you might have told the camera is much bigger. You can see a lot more now than you have been able to in the past. And that's because I've tested to be okay with showing this thing a bit. I'm going to fix that tiny little sliver back there that's not working. And just for other reasons as well. But it's also to educate the general public. Not a lot. Just enough to be able to talk about it with people, and also be able to know enough to learn even more and understand that. It's supposed to put a foundation down, a lot like elementary schools do, and only middle school does, here where I live, where I grew up. But before we wrap up, which we're basically doing already, I gotta do this. I haven't done the whole video, so I'm gonna do it now. I gotta ask you to comment, like, subscribe. It's YouTube. And the whole purpose of this series is to reach the algorithm, by the way. Is to have shorter videos for people to actually watch. But I am Joe the Teenage Astronaut, and I'll see you all next week, because he's all weekly.